The crisp autumn air carried a hint of approaching winter as pedestrians hurried past a small Italian restaurant in downtown Los Angeles. Among the crowd of well-dressed patrons and busy professionals stood a small figure, barely noticeable against the gleaming storefronts. A boy, no older than 12, with tattered clothes hanging from his thin frame and dirt smudged across his face, watched people pass by with calculating eyes. This wasn't his usual spot for asking for money. He'd been chased away from his regular corner by another homeless man who claimed the territory. Desperate and hungry after not eating for nearly 2 days, he'd wandered into this upscale neighborhood, knowing the risks but hoping the wealthier pedestrians might be more generous. The boy tensed as a black SUV pulled up to the curb. He recognized the telltale signs of celebrity arrival, the darkened windows, the driver who quickly exited to open the passenger door. His heart raced. Celebrities sometimes gave generous handouts if approached correctly. Timing was everything. A woman stepped out, sunglasses covering half her face despite the cloudy day, her dark hair falling loosely around her shoulders. Even with her attempts at anonymity, the boy instantly recognized Sandra Bullock. He'd seen her face on movie posters and billboards countless times. Behind her, another figure emerged from the vehicle, a tall man with shoulder-length dark hair, dressed simply in jeans and a black jacket. The boy recognized him too, Keanu Reeves. This was his chance. The boy moved quickly, approaching before the restaurant staff could intercept him. His stomach knotted with anxiety, but hunger drove him forward. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Could you spare $1? I haven't eaten in 2 days." Sandra Bullock paused, turning toward him. Unlike many celebrities who would hurry past or have security intervene, she looked directly at him. Really looked at him. The boy felt exposed under her gaze, as if she could see every hardship written on his face. "What's your name?" she asked gently. The question caught him off guard. People rarely asked his name. They either gave money to make him go away or ignored him completely. "Thomas," he answered, the truth spilling out before he could think to lie. Keanu Reeves had stopped a few paces ahead, observing the interaction with quiet intensity. He made no move to interrupt, but watched with an expression the boy couldn't quite read. "When was the last time you had a proper meal, Thomas?" Sandra asked, her voice low enough that passers-by couldn't hear. Thomas hesitated. This wasn't how these encounters usually went. "Day before yesterday," he admitted. "Someone gave me half a sandwich." Sandra glanced at Keanu, a silent communication passing between them. Then she did something that left Thomas speechless. Instead of reaching for her wallet to extract a single dollar, she placed her hand lightly on his shoulder. "Would you like to join us for lunch, Thomas?" The boy stared at her, certain he'd misheard. People like him weren't invited to sit at tables in restaurants with movie stars. It had to be a joke, a cruel prank that would end with laughter at his expense. I can't go in there," he stammered, looking down at his dirty clothes and worn-out shoes. "Yes, you can," Sandra said firmly. "You're with us." Keanu approached then, his expression warm as he nodded in agreement. "Everyone deserves a good meal," he said simply. Thomas stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. The restaurant host had appeared at the door, clearly recognizing the celebrities but looking uncertainly at the disheveled boy beside them. "We'll be 3 for lunch," Sandra stated, her tone leaving no room for objection. "And we'd like a private table, please." The host hesitated only briefly before nodding and gesturing them inside. As Thomas took his first tentative step toward the restaurant entrance, he couldn't know that this moment would be the dividing line in his life, everything that came before, and everything that would follow. Nor could he imagine how the simple act of asking for $1 would set in motion a chain of events that would change not only his life but the lives of everyone involved. The aroma of fresh bread and pasta sauce enveloped Thomas as he sat stiffly at the corner table. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been in a real restaurant. The white tablecloth intimidated him, and he was acutely aware of the dirt under his fingernails. Both celebrities had ordered water for the table, and Sandra had quietly asked the waiter to bring breadsticks right away, noticing how Thomas eyed the basket at the neighboring table. "You must be starving," she said gently, pushing the bread basket toward him when it arrived. Thomas hesitated, then took one, trying to eat slowly despite his hunger. "How long have you been on the streets, Thomas?" Keanu asked, his voice carrying no judgment, only genuine curiosity. Thomas swallowed hard. "Almost 8 months now," he replied, his eyes fixed on the tablecloth. The memories flooded back, the apartment eviction, his mother's tears, the shelter that couldn't take both of them, and her desperate decision. "My mom lost her job at the hospital last year," he continued, surprising himself with his candor. "She was a nurse's aide, but she got sick, really bad pneumonia, and missed too many shifts. We fell behind on rent." Sandra and Keanu exchanged glances, but remained silent, allowing Thomas to speak at his own pace. "We stayed with her friend for a while, but there wasn't much room. Then Mom heard about a live-in caretaker position in San Diego. The lady needed someone to help her full-time, but..." Thomas's voice faltered. "She couldn't take kids. Mom thought it would just be temporary, until she saved enough for a place of our own." Thomas described how his mother had arranged for him to stay with his elderly uncle, a man he barely knew. But the arrangement had quickly soured. His uncle's drinking problem made the small apartment a volatile environment. He'd get mad about everything. The TV being too loud, me eating too much food, whatever. Thomas absently traced patterns on the tablecloth with his finger. One night he was really bad. Threw a bottle at the wall. I grabbed my backpack and just left. For the first few weeks, Thomas had convinced himself his mother would return any day. He'd stayed near his old neighborhood, sleeping in parks and behind the shopping center, checking their old meeting spots daily. He'd even tried calling the number she'd left, only to discover it had been disconnected. I tried going to a youth shelter, but they said they'd have to report me to child services. Thomas looked up briefly, a flash of defiance in his eyes. "I'm not going into the system. My friend Bobby did, and he said it was worse than the streets." The waiter returned, and Sandra ordered food for all of them. Thomas continued his story, between hungry bites of pasta. He described how he'd learned to survive, which restrooms were safe to wash up in, which dumpsters behind restaurants had the best leftover food, which cops would look the other way and which would threaten to take him in. "Most days I can get a few dollars for food," Thomas explained. "I help Mr. Chen unload deliveries at his convenience store sometimes, or Mrs. Washington lets me sweep outside her salon. But last week, this older guy claimed my usual spot. Said he'd hurt me if I came back." "And your mother?" Keanu asked gently. "Have you heard from her?" Thomas shook his head, his fork pausing midway to his mouth. "She was supposed to call my uncle every week, but she stopped after a month. I think maybe the lady she worked for didn't want her anymore, or..." He didn't finish the thought. "I keep thinking she's looking for me," Thomas admitted, his voice barely audible. "That's why I stay around here. If I leave, how will she find me when she comes back?" Sandra reached across the table, her hand stopping just short of touching his. "Thomas, have you considered that she might be worried about you too? That she might not know how to find you either?" Thomas blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. He'd thought about this countless times, lying awake at night in whatever hidden corner he'd found to sleep in. What if his mother had returned to their old apartment, only to find strangers living there? What if she was searching the neighborhood right now, asking about a boy matching his description? "I left a note at our old place," he said. "But the new people probably threw it away. And I check the library computer sometimes, to see if she's posted anything online looking for me. But there's nothing." The weight of his situation hung heavy in the air. 8 months of survival, of constant vigilance, of hoping each day would be the day his life returned to normal. 8 months of growing invisibility, as pedestrians learned to look past him, as if acknowledging his existence would somehow make them complicit in his suffering. Today wasn't even about the dollar, Thomas confessed, meeting their eyes for the first time. I was so tired of being invisible. The restaurant had nearly emptied when Sandra finally signaled for the check. Thomas had fallen silent, exhausted from sharing his story and perhaps worried he'd said too much. The weight of his circumstances pressed heavily on the air between them. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street as pedestrians continued their hurried pace, unaware of the life-changing conversation taking place just behind the tinted windows of the restaurant. "Thomas," Sandra said gently, leaning forward. "I want to help you. Not just with a meal or some money, but really help you." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd heard similar promises before, well-meaning strangers who offered assistance, but disappeared when they realized the complexity of his situation. His expression remained guarded, a practiced skepticism that had served as protection on the streets. "I appreciate the food," he mumbled, already calculating his exit. "But I should probably go before it gets dark." Keanu, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Where will you sleep tonight?" The question hung in the air, its simplicity masking its weight. Thomas shrugged, attempting nonchalance. "I've got a spot," he said vaguely. "Under the bridge by the old record store. The security guard there doesn't chase kids away if we're quiet." Sandra exchanged a quick glance with Keanu before making a decision that would alter the course of multiple lives. "That's not happening," she said firmly. "Not tonight, not anymore." She pulled out her phone and stepped away from the table, speaking in hushed tones that Thomas couldn't quite make out. Keanu remained, his calm presence preventing Thomas from bolting toward the door. "She means it, you know," Keanu said quietly. "When Sandra decides to help someone, she doesn't do it halfway." Thomas fidgeted with his napkin. "Look, I appreciate it, but I don't need charity. And I definitely don't need someone calling social services. The minute they get involved, I'll never find my mom." "What if we could help you find her?" Keanu asked, the question hanging between them like a lifeline. Before Thomas could respond, Sandra returned, her expression resolute. "I've made some calls. I have a friend who runs a youth program not far from here. It's not a state facility, it's a private organization that helps kids in difficult situations." Thomas immediately tensed. "I told you, they don't automatically report to the system," Sandra continued, "especially in cases where there might be a family reunification possibility. They have resources to help locate your mother, Thomas. Real resources, not just checking libraries and leaving notes." The boy's eyes widened slightly, a crack appearing in his carefully constructed wall of distress. "They could find her? For real?" "They have connections with hospitals, employment agencies, even private investigators," Sandra explained. "If your mother is out there looking for you, they can help connect you. And in the meantime, you'd have a safe place to stay, meals, clean clothes." Thomas remained silent, weighing her words against his 8 months of hard-earned street wisdom. Promises were easy to make and even easier to break. "My friend Maria is coming to meet us," Sandra continued. "She runs the program. Just talk to her, hear what she has to say. If you don't like it, you can walk away. No one will force you." Keanu added, "Sometimes accepting help is the strongest thing you can do." The next hour passed in a blur. Maria arrived, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to see right through Thomas's defenses. She spoke directly to him, explaining the youth program without sugarcoating or condescension. It was a converted hotel, she explained, where kids in transition could stay in private rooms while receiving assistance. No locks on the outside of doors. No institutional uniforms or rigid schedules. "We help kids reconnect with family when possible," Maria explained. "And when it's not, we help them build new paths forward." Thomas listened, his skepticism gradually giving way to a dangerous emotion he'd nearly forgotten, hope. When Maria stepped away to make a call, Sandra leaned toward Thomas. "I want to sponsor your stay in the program," she said. "And I want to personally help with the search for your mother." "Why?" Thomas asked, the question bursting forth before he could stop it. Why would you do that for some random kid? Sandra's expression softened. Because 8 years ago, someone did something similar for my cousin's boy. He was in a different kind of trouble, but he needed someone to see him, really see him, when everyone else had looked away. She paused. Sometimes people just need a bridge to get from where they are to where they could be. Keanu nodded in agreement. And sometimes that bridge appears in unexpected ways. Like asking someone for $1 outside a restaurant. The decision wasn't easy. Thomas had survived by relying only on himself, by staying invisible when necessary and visible only on his own terms. Trusting these strangers, even famous ones, meant relinquishing the control he'd fought so hard to maintain. As the sun began to set, casting golden light through the restaurant windows, Thomas made his choice. Not with grand declarations or emotional surrender, but with a simple nod and 5 quiet words, I want to find her. That evening, as Maria drove Thomas to the youth center with Sandra and Keanu following in their SUV, none of them could have predicted the obstacles that still lay ahead. They couldn't know how their lives would intertwine in the coming days, or how this chance encounter would spark changes that would ripple outward in unexpected ways. They only knew that the journey had begun with a simple request for $1, and an even simpler decision to truly see the person asking. The youth center stood in stark contrast to what Thomas had imagined. No institutional gray walls or barred windows, but a renovated 3-story building with colorful murals decorating its entrance. His room, though small, contained a real bed with clean sheets, a dresser, and even a small desk by the window. For the first night in months, Thomas slept without one eye open, without clutching his backpack to his chest. But old habits died hard. The first week was marked by Thomas's reluctance to fully engage. He kept to himself during group activities, ate quickly at mealtimes, and regarded the staff with lingering suspicion. Maria assured Sandra and Keanu, who checked in daily, that this was normal. Trust is earned, not given, Maria explained during one of their visits. Especially for kids who've had promises broken before. Sandra had been true to her word. She'd hired a private investigator named Ray, a former police detective who specialized in missing persons cases. He sat with Thomas for hours, patiently extracting details about his mother that might help locate her, her full name, previous workplaces, friends, distinctive features, even her favorite places to shop. The caretaker job in San Diego is our best lead, Ray explained one afternoon as they all gathered in Maria's office. If we can find the employer, we can trace where she went next. Keanu, who had initially seemed likely to fade into the background of this effort, surprised everyone by becoming a steady presence. He visited regularly, often bringing books he thought Thomas might enjoy or simply sitting quietly while the boy worked through his emotions with the center's counselor. He reminds me of myself at that age, Keanu confided to Sandra after one particularly difficult day when Thomas had retreated into angry silence following a disappointing lead. Trying so hard to be self-sufficient that accepting help feels like failure. The search for Thomas's mother hit roadblock after roadblock. The San Diego lead evaporated when they discovered the elderly woman who had supposedly hired her had passed away months ago. Her family had no records of a live-in caretaker matching the description. 3 weeks into his stay at the center, Thomas experienced his first major breakdown. Sandra arrived to find him hurling books across his room, tears streaming down his face. "She doesn't want to be found," he shouted when Sandra entered. "She left me on purpose." "Everyone does." Sandra didn't offer empty reassurances. Instead, she sat on the floor beside him, her back against the wall, and waited until his storm of emotion had passed enough for him to hear her. "My father left when I was about your age," she said quietly. "Just packed up and disappeared. For years, I believed it was because of something I'd done." Thomas wiped roughly at his face with his sleeve. "Was it?" "No. He had his own demons, his own battles that had nothing to do with me. But that didn't stop me from believing it was my fault." She paused. "The hardest lesson I ever learned was that sometimes people leave because of their own pain, not because of anything we did or didn't do. Thomas absorbed this, his breathing gradually steadying. So what am I supposed to do now? We keep looking, she said simply. And while we look, you work on becoming the person you want to be, regardless of whether we find her tomorrow or next year. That conversation marked a turning point. Thomas began participating in the center's educational program, catching up on the months of schooling he'd missed. He discovered a talent for mathematics that surprised even him, and an interest in computers that the center's tech volunteer nurtured with patient guidance. Meanwhile, Ray continued his methodical investigation. He tracked down Thomas's uncle, now in a rehabilitation facility, who revealed that Thomas's mother had called once more after Thomas had run away, frantically trying to locate her son. The uncle, in an alcoholic haze, had simply told her the boy was gone and hung up. That's something, Ray said encouragingly. It means she was looking for you, Thomas. She didn't abandon you. In the 5th week, a potential breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Keanu, who had been quietly making inquiries through his own network, received information about a woman matching Thomas's mother's description working at a small hospice facility in Bakersfield, some 2 hours north of Los Angeles. It might be nothing, he cautioned as they gathered in Maria's office. But the timing fits. She would have gone there after the San Diego position ended. Thomas sat perfectly still, afraid to invest in hope yet unable to resist its pull. When can we check? He asked, his voice barely audible. I've already called, Ray said. They confirmed they had a nurse's aide matching her name working there 3 months ago. She left approximately 6 weeks ago. Thomas's face fell. Another dead end. But, Ray continued, she left a forwarding address for her final paycheck. An apartment complex back here in Los Angeles. The room fell silent as the implication sank in. She had returned to the city. She had been here, possibly looking for her son, while he slept under bridges and behind dumpsters, both of them separated by the vast anonymity of urban sprawl. We'll go first thing tomorrow, Sandra said, her tone brooking no argument. Ray and I will. Check it out, then come back for you if, no, Thomas interrupted, a new firmness in his voice. I need to be there. If it's her. I need to see for myself. The adults exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Keanu spoke. He's right. This is his journey. None of them slept well that night. Thomas lay awake, cycling through every possible scenario, his mother embracing him with tears of joy, his mother rejecting him, arriving to find a stranger with the same name, or an empty apartment with no answers at all. By morning, dark circles rimmed his eyes, but a determined set to his jaw prevented anyone from suggesting he stay behind. As they drove toward the address in East Los Angeles, the city passing in a blur outside the windows, Thomas clutched the small photo of his mother he'd kept in his backpack through all those months on the street. It was their only visual confirmation, a smiling woman with Thomas's same dark eyes, her arm around a younger version of her son at a park. The apartment building came into view, a modest complex with peeling paint but neatly maintained grounds. Ray had called ahead to confirm the apartment number but had revealed nothing about their purpose, wanting to avoid raising false hopes or alarming the current resident. As they parked, Thomas's courage nearly failed him. The possibility of final, crushing disappointment loomed larger than the hope of reunion. His hand froze on the car door handle, unable to push it open. Whatever happens in there, Sandra said gently, you're not alone anymore. Remember that. Thomas nodded, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the unknown future awaiting him just beyond the building's faded blue door. The stairwell smelled of disinfectant and cooking spices, a blend that reminded Thomas of apartment buildings from his earlier childhood. Each step upward felt monumental, as if he were climbing toward not just the 3rd floor, but toward a crossroads in his life. Sandra and Keanu flanked him protectively, while Ray led the way, his experienced eyes scanning their surroundings. Apartment 312 stood at the end of a dimly lit hallway. Its door, unlike some others, had no personal touches, no welcome mat, no seasonal wreath, nothing to indicate the personality of whoever dwelled within. Thomas stared at the brass numbers, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Do you want me to knock?" Ray asked quietly. Thomas shook his head. This moment belonged to him. With a trembling hand, he rapped 3 times on the door, then stepped back slightly, unconsciously positioning himself between Sandra and Keanu as if drawing strength from their presence. Silence stretched for several seconds. Thomas's hope began to crumble, the familiar weight of disappointment settling in his chest. Then came the sound of movement from inside, light footsteps approaching the door. The lock clicked. The door opened. A woman stood in the doorway, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing nurse's scrubs that suggested she'd recently returned from work. She looked tired, with shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. For a moment, she stared blankly at the group, her mind seemingly processing why 2 Hollywood celebrities might be standing outside her apartment. Then her gaze fell on Thomas. "Tommy," she whispered, her voice breaking on the single word. Time seemed to pause as mother and son stared at each other across the threshold that had symbolically separated them for 8 long months. Thomas couldn't speak, couldn't move, the reality of seeing her freezing him in place. "Is it really you?" she asked, her hand covering her mouth, tears already forming. "I've been searching everywhere. I put up flyers, called shelters, filed police reports." Thomas broke free from his paralysis and lurched forward into his mother's arms. She caught him, clutching him to her chest as if afraid he might disappear again. They sank to their knees in the doorway, both sobbing with the release of months of fear, loneliness, and desperate hope. Behind them, Sandra wiped tears from her own eyes while Keanu placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Ray stepped back discreetly, giving the reunited family their moment while still keeping a professional eye on the situation. Eventually, Thomas and his mother, Elena, moved inside the small apartment, inviting the others to join them. The space was sparsely furnished but clean, with a small table covered in papers, missing person flyers with Thomas's face, contact information for shelters and youth services, bus schedules marked with routes she'd searched. "I never stopped looking," Elena said, still holding Thomas's hand as if afraid to let go. "When I came back from San Diego and found you'd run away from Gary's." She shook her head, regret etching lines around her eyes. "I should never have left you with him. I didn't know how bad his drinking had gotten." The story unfolded gradually. The San Diego position had ended when her elderly charge passed away. Elena had immediately returned to Los Angeles, only to discover Thomas missing and her brother-in-law unable to provide clear information about when or why he'd left. She'd taken the hospice job in Bakersfield only because they offered immediate employment and housing, allowing her to save money faster while continuing to search for Thomas whenever she could return to Los Angeles. "I finally saved enough for this apartment 2 months ago," she explained. "I took a position at Memorial Hospital so I could be in the city full-time to look for you." Her voice broke again. "I walked your old routes to school. I checked the parks. I even sat outside your friend Bobby's building for hours, hoping to catch a glimpse of you." "I was hiding," Thomas admitted. I thought maybe you weren't coming back." "Never," Elena said fiercely. "I would never abandon you, Tommy. Never." As the emotional reunion continued, practical matters eventually surfaced. Elena expressed profound gratitude to Sandra and Keanu, initially overwhelmed by the realization that 2 famous actors had become her son's protectors. But celebrity awe quickly gave way to mother's gratitude as she understood the extent of their involvement in bringing her son home. "How can I ever repay you?" she asked, looking between them with tear-stained cheeks. "There's nothing to repay," Sandra assured her. "But there is something we'd like to offer, if you're willing to hear us out." Over the next hour, as Ray excused himself to give the group privacy, Sandra and Keanu outlined a proposal they'd discussed during the weeks of searching. They had connections with a foundation that provided educational support and housing assistance to families in transition. Elena and Thomas could remain in this apartment with rental assistance while Elena established herself at her new job. Thomas could attend a good school nearby, with tutoring to help him catch up on missed education. "We want to help build a bridge to your future," Sandra explained, echoing the words she'd said to Thomas weeks earlier. "Not a handout, but a genuine opportunity for both of you to rebuild without the constant pressure of survival." Elena listened intently, her initial instinct to refuse such generosity gradually giving way to pragmatic understanding. This wasn't about charity, it was about community, about recognizing that sometimes people need temporary support to prevent permanent catastrophe. "I'll accept," she said finally, on one condition. Her eyes held a determined glint. "When we're back on our feet, you have to let me help someone else the way you've helped us. Pass it forward." Keanu smiled. "That's exactly what we hoped you'd say." The transition wasn't seamless. Thomas struggled with nightmares from his time on the streets. Elena battled guilt over their separation. But with counseling arranged through Maria's connections and the stability of a secure home, they began healing together. 6 months later, Thomas stood nervously in the community center attached to the youth program where he'd once stayed. Now he was helping younger kids with their math homework as part of his own commitment to passing it forward. He discovered that teaching others reinforced his own learning, helping him catch up academically while building confidence. Sandra visited occasionally, keeping her promise to stay connected rather than being a one-time benefactor who disappeared after the crisis passed. During one such visit, she found Thomas explaining fractions to a young girl whose family was staying at the shelter temporarily. "They don't seem so scary once you break them down into pieces you understand," Thomas was saying patiently. Sandra smiled, recognizing that he was talking about more than just mathematics. The broken pieces of his life had been reassembled into something stronger, with the fracture lines still visible but no longer threatening the whole. Later, as they walked through the center's small garden, Thomas surprised her with a question. "Do you remember what you said that first day? About how sometimes people just need a bridge?" Sandra nodded. "I've been thinking," he continued thoughtfully. "It wasn't just about finding my mom or getting off the streets. It was about being seen, really seen, when I felt invisible." "That's the hardest bridge to build," Sandra agreed. "The one between isolation and connection." Thomas looked up at her, his eyes clear and direct in a way they hadn't been that first day outside the restaurant. "I'm going to build bridges too," he said with quiet certainty. "Different kinds, maybe. But I want to help people be seen." As Sandra drove away that afternoon, she reflected on how a simple request for $1 had cascaded into profound change. The boy who had approached her had been desperate and alone, the young man she'd just left was becoming a builder of his own life and the lives of others. She thought about how often people walked past those in need, avoiding eye contact, pretending not to see. How easy it would have been to hand Thomas $1 that day and continue into the restaurant, their lives touching for mere seconds before diverging forever. How many potential connections, how many possible bridges, remained unbuilt because people chose not to truly see each other? The greatest poverty, she realized, wasn't always a lack of money or resources. Sometimes it was a poverty of being unseen, unheard, and ultimately forgotten. And the greatest gift was not the financial support she and Keanu had provided, but the simple, powerful act of truly seeing another human being in their moment of need. That, perhaps, was the bridge that mattered most.